How can you build resilience? I'm Kate Save. The Inspired CEO starts now. Welcome to The Inspired CEO, where each episode we explore the innovative wellness practices that are driving success and longevity in the modern business world. My next guest is a renowned neuroscientist, exercise physiologist and nutritionist with a background as a British Royal Navy Aircrew officer and a focus on resilience. He's the author of Death by Comfort and host of the Paul Taylor podcast. Welcome, Paul. Thank you for coming in today.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You have such a fascinating career. So take us back to the start. Take us back to where you started. So you started in the military?
I did, yeah. So I went to university, I did a degree and then did a master's degree in sports science actually, and then decided I needed something a little bit more exciting.
Wow.
So I joined the military and flew in helicopters for 8 years.
Incredible. And I'm sure you have some life lessons there that you will never forget.
Oh yes, plenty of those. Particularly around the training, lots of life lessons around the training, but then also I did anti-submarine warfare for a few years, but then I did helicopter search and rescue in the mountains and islands of Scotland, which was pretty amazing.
Incredible. And how do you think that experience has shaped where you've gone now in your own business and being focusing on stress resilience and obviously with your book Death by Comfort, trying to teach people how to live in a way that really supports longevity as opposed to sinking into this sad, comfortable life that we have? Yeah,
look, for me, I think the military training had a big impact on that, but also the combination of, because I had a master's in sports science before I joined, I kind of looked through stress with a different lens, and particularly when I did combat survival and resistance to interrogation training, which was 10 days of pretty hardcore stuff.
Is it like Goggins? I've read the Goggins books and I've seen some of this training. Tell us about that training.
Well, so we had 10 days in the middle of winter in the UK when it actually gets cold. We had no sleeping bags. In the 10 days, the only food they gave us was a chicken between 4 people, and it was alive when we got it.
No way.
Oh yes, and we got thrashed every day physically, you know, really worn down. And then the second 5 days was escape and evasion, where we were hunted by a hunter force.
What?
And then at the end of it, we got interrogated for 12 hours. We were in stress positions, white noise, hooded the whole time. And
what's a stress position?
So stress positions would be stuff like sitting cross-legged with your hands behind your back, or standing with your hands leaning up against the wall for long periods of time. And after a while they hurt, and then they really, really hurt. And then when you move, somebody hits you a bit of a whack, and then when you collapse, you get put in another stress position. And the entire time you're hooded, so there's sensory deprivation, you've got white noise playing at the volume you'd hear music in a nightclub. So it becomes very disorienting and pretty stressful, particularly when you've had that 10 days of kind of softening you up, shall we say.
So the physical stuff is the softening you up for that.
Yeah,
that
and then the
stress.
psychological, and then the when you get interrogated, it's not that pleasant. But the interesting thing that I realized was after that, stuff that used to be stressful was no longer stressful.
What's an example?
So something happened to me a couple of weeks later that I normally would have found stressful, and it was just like water off a duck's back. And that's when I, with my exercise science background, which you have, realized that exercise is really good for us because it's a stressor.
Yeah.
And then we adapt to that stressor, we become more resilient to it. And that's when I started thinking, maybe psychological stress is just like that physical stress, right? And it's the adaptation to the stress that makes you bigger, faster, stronger. And then this idea of then progressive overload. So this is the stuff that a lot of people don't talk about, and particularly in COVID, there was a lot of psychologists talking about self-care and self-compassion, and I'm like, that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Like, that won't get you through really tough times. A lot of resilience, or I like to talk about hardiness now, has to be earned for going through hard things. You know, that old school of hard knocks that people talk about, it's very real.
So in society, in this day and age, is there such thing, or are we cruising through without being put through some of these challenges? And is this why maybe we're not as resilient?
This is massive, right? For me, we are trying to sanitize the world of stress. And we're particularly doing it with our kids as well. And what we're actually doing is robbing them of really important lessons for resilience, right? You have to go through hard things. The job of parents is to actually not to stop your kids going through hard stuff, but to be around to pick them up and help them to learn the lessons, right? That for me is the key thing. And it's getting worse when you look at university and all of these trigger warnings and people then opt out. And the research is now showing that it can actually make people's mental health worse, not better.
I think I just had an epiphany moment when you said that that physical stress is just like the mental stress. However, people understand how to put themselves through physical stress, and a lot of people now would have tried your CrossFits and all those sorts of really challenging workouts, but not many people are out there talking about using that same sort of stress in a mental fitness to build that adaptability to cope with everyday life.
And I talk about stress fitness and use that continuum of physical fitness, right? And we get people are low fitness, people are high fitness. The thing that sets them apart is the people who are high fit do the work. And for me, it's the same with mental fitness. You've got to be doing the work, right? And that's a combination of getting out of your comfort zone, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, then then bringing in all of the recovery and things like that. And yes, self-care and self-compassion have a role, but it's also the mindset that you have when you're going into it. This whole idea of challenge versus threat, which I really learned in the military, right? I don't think I heard the term stress mentioned in the military. I heard the word challenge mentioned a lot. And what we now know is if you have a threat response, if you view something as potentially threatening and stressful, it activates cortisol, right, which has a half-life in the body of over an hour and can be very debilitating. But if you view that same thing as a challenge, it activates your fight or flight response, which is the adaptive part of your stress response. And the half-life of those chemicals, adrenaline and noradrenaline, are just a matter of minutes. So you come back to homeostasis much quicker than, you know, if people are then thinking about threat, loss, this is bad, that's bad, that bad news over there, this person's doing that to me. It's just cortisol, cortisol, cortisol. And that becomes really debilitating. And then interferes with your ability to then handle stress later on.
That just gives me a whole new perspective of different people and how they manage their stress, because you see certain people that flip at the very smallest of things, and obviously there's a build up in the background, but there's no release for them. They don't know how to get that release. So where can people start with this? If they are someone who blows up at the smallest of things, how do you wind them back?
So I think the key thing is understanding what happens in the brain. So when people are exposed to chronic stress that they can't manage, what happens is the amygdala, the part of the brain that processes strong emotions, heavily involved in the stress response, it actually hypertrophies. It grows bigger and becomes more sensitive, right? Just like if you train your muscles lots, they adapt to our environmental inputs. And this is a beautiful adaptive response if you live in a dangerous world, because it's saying, Kate, danger, danger, danger. Your amygdala becomes bigger, more sensitive, then you become hypervigilant to threat. So you're non-consciously scanning the environment for bad stuff. And then when you find it, you linger on it much longer. And we see all of that in the environment. You just need to read the news, get on social media. And so the brain gets this hypervigilance to threat. So it's understanding that. Now, what we know is you can actually remodel that. So using techniques to manage your stress in and of the moment, such as breath work, cognitive reframing, these sorts of things, that helps you to manage it in and of the moment. But Ken has a neuroplastic feedback loop that can remodel the amygdala. But for me, this needs to come in conjunction with stress tolerance training. And for me, the best thing, you mentioned CrossFit, any type of exercise that is making you uncomfortable, what most people don't realize, it's the exact same stress response that if you do physical exercise as if you have mental or emotional stress. It's all about your adrenal glands and the release of adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol. So I'm a big fan of people doing vigorous exercise to train their stress response system globally. Right?
Gosh.
And it's what we call the cross-stressor hypothesis, right? Which is, if I regularly expose myself to the stress of exercise, not only do I enhance my ability to deal with that stress, but I also enhance my ability to deal with psychological and emotional stress. And there's research showing that that is absolutely the case, right? So we have to do hard things if we really want to become hardy and resilient. That's the key thing. Right?
Makes perfect sense. And for someone out there who is not fit and they're struggling with this chronic stress, there are simple ways to start that process with cold water therapy.
Absolutely.
So you don't have to start fit to...
No. And you know, the beauty is, for people who are not fit, I love working with those people because their window of adaptation is massive, right? They will get fit really quick, much quicker. Like, they'll get a 20% improvement in their fitness way easier than me or you who are well trained, right? So that's the beauty of it, that they can then go out and do anything. And for everybody,
does that translate into the 20 or 30% benefit straight away into that stress response?
Look, there's nobody who's done the research on it, but knowing how this works, I would absolutely say it would do.
Wow.
And then it's in conjunction, you know, so working on your physical fitness, getting used to being physically uncomfortable, and then reflecting on it afterwards and going, yeah, go me. You know, that reflection piece is really important. But then, you know, just then exposing yourself to other stressors that are manageable. The best treatment for anxiety is not avoidance. It is exposure therapy, but it's got to be graded. You know, just like for training someone with exercise, as you know, that concept of progressive overload, incremental progressive overload. So it's just doing things that make you a little bit uncomfortable. And I like to get the people to think about what I call their sage, their best self. Like, what would my sage do right now? And so it's just leaning into discomfort and having that as a real attitude, I think, is hugely, hugely important.
Incredible. So to finish off, tell us what you do to build your fitness and your mental fitness and your physical fitness.
Yeah, so exercise is a huge component. I actually do CrossFit, and I do high intensity interval training as well. So think of what's happening to the stress response when you do that. In the work period, you're activating the sympathetic nervous system, and then when you recover, you're activating the parasympathetic, which is rest, digest, and recover, right? So it's on, off, and that's training that system globally.
To understand calm, to come back to rest.
And then breath work for me is really, really critical, right? So slow, controlled breathing to control your arousal. We can also do controlled hyperventilation to upregulate your arousal if you're tired, instead of reaching for the sugar or the caffeine. But also, I'm a big fan of cold exposure, and many organizations I'm known as the cold shower guy. And it's because you get physiological responses, right? You get increases in dopamine and noradrenaline.
So you feel good, you feel
energized. Amazing, you feel energized, but also it's that psychological thing, because it's uncomfortable. And using the breath in the shower, slow, controlled breathing, to control that desire to want to get the hell out there, that's a really good way of people enhancing their stress tolerance, or stress fitness, as I like to say.
And that makes perfect sense, that you do need that pat on the back and that reflection moment to recognize that you've done it.
That I've just done something, right? Go me. You got to have that. And then, you know, things that are really critical that a lot of people don't talk about with resilience is your sleep hygiene. You've got to be all over it. Your sleep is a weapon. It's a weapon, right? And then nutrition. So a lot of people don't realize ultra-processed foods. There was an umbrella review recently published that you're probably aware of that showed that increasing your consumption of ultra-processed foods increases anxiety risk by 48% and common mental health disorders by 53%.
Do you talk about some of these things in your new book, Death by Comfort?
I do.
Absolutely.
I absolutely do.
So if people want to learn more about this topic, so they can listen into the Paul Taylor podcast.
That's the one.
And get a copy of Death by Comfort. So thank you very much for coming in today, Paul.
Absolute pleasure. And it's about getting comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Well, this is Ticker, and we'll be right back.
You're watching Ticker. We'll have more in just a few minutes.